Newvision.
Hi, welcome to Newvision. The program you're about to see is a collection of short videos and film that have been produced in the Newcastle and Hunter region. It's been a cooperative effort. We've collected material from TAFE colleges, Aboriginal groups, film societies, cine clubs, and most importantly, individuals. This show is a sample of public television. Public television is for everyone. Keep in mind that ordinary people have produced these items without formal training and without access to complex technology. Unlike commercial television, public TV comes directly from the people and isn't motivated by profit. If you have films, videos, or even ideas, you're more than welcome to send them in. We'll give you the address a little later. So have a look at what the Hunter region can produce.
Once upon a time, the world was full of chickens. It was all chickens. Everywhere you turned, it was chickens. To make matters worse, there was a great shortage of eggs. Even the chickens couldn't find any. All the chickens could find were other chickens. Everywhere you looked, you'd see chickens. Even if you didn't look, you'd still find them. All the chickens did was to look at other chickens. There was a dog. His name was Big Time Fred. The chickens looked at him all day too. At night, even though they couldn't see him in the dark, they looked to where they thought he was. There was also an elephant. Her name was Smokey. The chickens looked at her as well. Big Time Fred and Smokey the elephant got fed up looking at chickens, so they looked at each other instead. But they soon got tired of this. One day, the dog walked to the other side of the elephant to see what she was like. But she was no different from the other side. But while he was there, Big Time Fred took a photo of the other side of Smokey the elephant. But when the photo developed, all they could see was chickens. Nothing but chickens. It was all chickens. That was a feather that broke the dog's back. The chickens would have to go. Soon there wasn't a chicken left standing. But they forgot one thing. Fallout. heaven was beautiful, except for one little thing. All the chickens had moved in first. Even the other place couldn't be as bad as this. Big-time Fred and Smokey the elephant thought hell was terrific. Nice warm climate, plenty of old friends, and best of all, no stupid chickens to get under their feet.
Thing started when we read in the newspaper that there was this $17 million harbour foreshore plan devised to coincide with the bicentennial year. We just wondered from the drawings what it would look like in, real life, and how that could upset a whole neighbourhood or improve it, but something would definitely, drastically change within that time span of 3 years or whatever. So I just thought it would be interesting to document the people who lived here and some of the people who, had, grown up here, or artists who lived here now.
The first step was to hold a public meeting to gauge the level of support for such a project within the East End community. So we held a public meeting at TPI House in Scott Street in April 1984, where we invited residents to participate by supplying memorabilia and oral histories, and then perhaps learning to make their own prints. The Awabakal Aboriginal Cooperative formed a silkscreen collective and made their first prints in a 12-week course at the Printmakers Workshop. They focused their attention on the Aboriginal legend of the giant black kangaroo who lived on Nobby's Island long before the white man constructed the breakwater, joining Nobby's to the mainland.
The whole area seems to be changing now.
Yeah. It has changed. Newcastle East was always a little intact residential island almost, and it had been fairly self-sufficient, I think, over the years. And it has to do, I think, with the proximity of one neighbour to another and things like that. But of course the character of Newcastle East has changed because a lot of older residents aren't here any longer, and so new people have moved in, and those new people plug into other sorts of support systems other than just, the neighbourhood support system. I think it has retained a lot of that identity that made it special. But, maybe the actual neighbourliness and mutual support thing has lessened to a degree.
Well, Newcastle's one of those places where, with its convict origins, I don't think that a great deal of thought was given to the natural beauty of the place. It was really, probably one of the most beautiful places, naturally. You know, the fact that they were cutting knobbies down gives you an idea of how they thought about the environment. And when you see these photographs, these old paintings and things like that and drawings, you just realise just how distinctive the landscape was. This is the place where coal was first discovered. It's the place where there's the only British fortress, you know, enclosed fortress on the coast of Australia, at Fort Scratchley. The breakwater, which is the most important, significant development of the port of Newcastle, because it's the first stage in developing the port of Newcastle.
Newcastle East, the site of the convict stockade and jail, isolated from the rest of the township by sandhills, was considered a no man's land. However, from the 1890s up to the 20s, the East End was developed as a glamorous residential resort, with villas, guest houses and cafes being constructed.
When I was a little girl, I used to always have the band every Sunday on the top of the beach. And people would sit around and then they'd come with little money boxes.
By the 30s, the streets housed working families in rows of terraces, and many of these dwellings still stand, saved from the developers by the Newcastle East Residents Group and the Trades Hall Council in the 70s. By the 50s, the word eyesore was being used constantly to describe the area. Newcastle East had for a long time been regarded as a rather sleazy, undesirable place to live. Its industrial functional role was never more evident than in those years when the powerhouse dominated the area and held up any interest in development of the East End. The demise of the guest houses, hotels and cafes during the 50s meant the loss of the East End as a resort area. And this decline continued through to the late 70s. The planned demolition of the Golden Sands Hotel and other shops, houses and residential flats around the present Pacific Park brought the dispute between residents and Newcastle City Council to a head. From the early 50s up to the 1980s, there were so many successive plans for the East End to become a showplace for the city that one finds it difficult to follow. Varying approaches were taken by planners to considerations such as height, density, zoning and attitudes towards the residents. This resulted in markedly different development plans, all of which were considered to be most beneficial to Newcastle East. When you did your survey going around the East End, they were quite shocked by what was planned for the East End.
Oh, quite shocked. And they had no previous knowledge that those plans were even in the pipeline. And they were plans for major redevelopment of this area. But more to the point, what was more threatening to the residents was that they involved the demolition of a great deal of the housing stock that existed at that time. And inspections had been made, and lots of people were upset about, you know, that process occurring without any involvement on the part of the residents in those decisions.
Regarded by many as the main obstacle to beautification of the Newcastle Harbour foreshore, the powerhouse, which was built in 1927, was finally demolished in 1978. The vacant land now forms part of the Bicentennial Housing Commission project.
Do you think the show will have much relevance to other communities?
Well, in its imagery, it is very specific to the East End of Newcastle, but as a basic idea of following up a kind of, or exploring a transition period in a community, I think it could be quite relevant to other communities.
Yes.
you up so well. It taught you everything you needed to know. You learned morals, scruples, dreams. They stood by you and watched you grow. That was before you found the world. Everything fell apart. All your morals, scruples, dreams shattered back to the start. It's the concrete world we live and love. This is your conclusion. It's a concrete world we live and love. Give up your illusion. Down through the ages it's been like this. The big man crushes the poor. If not for your sex and drugs, life would be a bore. While we're down here spending our lives, living, working like beasts. The rich, fat and powerful, gold-plated rooms, sit all day and feast. It's a concrete world we live and love. This is your conclusion. It's a concrete world we live and love. Give up your illusion. Dog, tooth and claw, no one ever wins. They don't care what you do, they don't care for your sins. Protest, crime, give us peace, nuclear arms reduction. Sorry, I can't give today, it's not a tax deduction. It's a concrete world we live and love. This is your concrete world we live and love.
Hello. Well, we're about halfway through our program, and from what you've seen, you're no doubt beginning to realise the diversity of content public television allows. Now, like me, you may not like it all, but it is interesting to have the opportunity to experience different views. Television in the hands of the community opens up access to a medium which has, until now, been dominated by large corporations. Of course, the format and style of production is different to what we have all experienced on existing channels. Firstly, commercial standards are not necessarily applicable or even desired. But more importantly, the accessibility of public television allows for different forms of expression that wouldn't have a hope of getting airplay on mainstream TV. At the moment, the ideas and interests of smaller community groups are drastically underrepresented in the media. Local and regional information and entertainment will be further squeezed out by commercial networking. We hope to use Newvision as a forum for the interests of communities and groups within the Newcastle and Hunter region. We're not looking for particular styles or content in programs, our main point being public accessibility. By demonstrating the local talent, we hope to encourage funding of research and exploration of independent productions in the Hunter. Television is a powerful and important medium in our society, so why leave it in the hands of but a few when ordinary folk do have the ideas and ability to make worthwhile programs? Of course there are needs. To make this work, we shall need to support Newvision as a community with ideas, sponsorship, as well as the production of programs. To do so, and for any further information, contact this address: Post Office Box 102, Mayfield, Newcastle 2304. With this support, all we need is for the government to supply the airwaves. And now, on with our program.
The wetlands of the Lower Hunter Valley are among the most extensive and valuable along the New South Wales coast. Many different communities are represented, including estuarine mudflats, mangrove forests, salt marshes, saline pastures and reed beds, as well as brackish and freshwater swamplands. Since first European settlement, large areas of wetland have been degraded or destroyed because their value was not widely appreciated. From around 1800, the Hunter estuary was dominated by a mosaic of low islands, separated by tidal channels and flanked by mangroves. By around 1950, the islands had been substantially cleared, but their configurations were essentially unchanged until the 1953 Newcastle Harbour Improvement Act was passed. This act gave the Department of Public Works the task of reclaiming the area to form the Kooragang Island Industrial Estate. Community awareness of the wetlands remained low, and it was not until the 1970s that there was any significant support for the protection of nature conservation on Kooragang Island. In 1970, floodgates were completed on Ironbark Creek. The gates have managed to almost exclude tidal flow in the southern section of Hexham Swamp. The result has been the degradation of several hundreds of hectares of mangrove forest and salt marsh. The value of the wetlands as nursery areas for fish and crustaceans, as floodwater storage areas, as sumps and filters protecting the water quality of estuaries, as a habitat for many species of migratory wading birds, is now more widely appreciated. The increased public awareness of wetland values has been reflected in a number of planning and land management decisions relating to the estuary. In December 1982, a local environments plan was introduced to protect and enhance the nature of Hexham Swamp. A nature reserve was proposed to cover the swamp floor and valuable margins. In March 1983, a nature reserve was established covering 800 hectares of Kooragang Island. The reserve is listed as a wetland of international importance and, along with other components of the Hunter Estuary, has been placed on the interim register of the National Estate. In April 1984, Newcastle City Council resolved that the wetlands at Shortland should be set aside as a waterfowl reserve and managed for the purpose of passive recreation. In July 1984, BHP withdrew from public option over 700 hectares of land containing valuable wetlands. It is now hoped that the area will be incorporated into the Kooragang Nature Reserve. In August 1984, Newcastle City Council resolved to seek the transfer of 800 hectares of publicly owned land at Hexham Swamp to the National Parks and Wildlife Service as the core area of the Nature Reserve. In September 1984, the Hunter Wetlands Trust launched a campaign to fund the establishment of the Shortland Wetlands Centre. The project is seen to have the potential as part of the tourism strategy for the Hunter. The wetlands at Shortland are an oasis and only a few kilometres from the industrial city of Newcastle. They are particularly noted for the haven they offer to a spectacular array of water birds. The Wetlands Centre include a feeding pond to allow observation of water birds at close quarters, walking trails linking the wetlands and providing boardwalks, hides and observation towers in appropriate places to control public access. Overseas examples suggest that the Shortland Wetlands Centre could provide the opportunity for canoe access to Ironbark Creek and through it to some areas of a Hexham Swamp Nature Reserve. The future of the Hunter Wetlands region depends on effective planning and land use management with the support of a sympathetic public. The initiatives taken by the Hunter Wetlands Trust are fundamental to wetland conservation and management, both in the Hunter region and further afield.
Supernova is Newcastle's own science and technology museum, presently situated upstairs in the old store building at Hunter Street West. It is designed for family and school groups to go in and experience hands-on scientific apparatus.
Our great-grandmother, she lives with us sometimes. They're our neighbours, Peter and Bronwyn, they're great.
Where's their kids?
They haven't got any children.
Who's that?
Uncle Tim with his new baby. They're our favourite cousins, Brad, Jim, David with Auntie Lynn and Uncle Bob. There's Wendy with a little boy.
Is Tim her husband?
No, she lives on her own.
Who's that?
My mum.
What's she doing there?
She works there.
In life, things aren't always what you think they are. People make assumptions about families. They make assumptions about the roles men and women play in families and in society. Most women and men in Australia still get married, but childbearing and rearing has become a shorter stage in a woman's life. Some people are choosing not to have children at all. The average Australian woman spends about 12 years at school, works in paid employment for about 10 years, spends some time in unpaid work rearing her children, and then spends up to another 30 years working or looking for paid work. One of the myths about Australian families is that men are the sole breadwinners for their nuclear families. The facts are that over 40% of households in Australia have two incomes. In one-income families, almost one-third of the breadwinners are women. So most Australians do live in families, but nuclear families with only fathers working are the minority. Single-parent families make up 13% of all families with dependent children, and 85% of single-parent families are headed by women. Another myth. Women are only going to get married, give up work, and have kids. Let's look at the statistics. 2/3 of women who work are married. 1 in 3 mothers with children under 12 have a job. In fact, married women with dependent children are more likely to be in the labour force than married women without dependent children. So some of our assumptions about women in the workforce could be wrong. The last 20 years have seen a lot of changes in Australia. There's been increased participation by women in the workforce, increased participation by married women, and increased part-time employment, especially for women. But some things haven't changed. The narrow range of industries that employ women. The persistence of unequal pay rates between men and women. And the high rates of female unemployment. Almost 2/3 of women workers are employed in just 3 occupational areas: clerical, sales, and services. And clerical and sales are being hard hit by technological changes and restructuring. So a woman may get married, may give up work and have children, but the statistics say she will return to work and be more likely to be threatened with unemployment than her male colleagues, and on average earn only 67% of the male wage. It doesn't seem quite fair, does it? Well, sexism isn't. It's just like being biased because of a person's race, class, or culture. Treating people differently and unfairly because of their sex restricts the range of options for women and for men. Employment options, educational options, life options. If society is reflected in schools and sexism exists in society, then sexism could be stopping students in your school from getting a fair go. Ask a few questions. Do teachers spend more class time with boys? Do materials and teaching strategies meet the interests of both boys and girls? Do teachers expect different results from girls and boys? Are leadership roles shared amongst boys and girls? Are women well represented on the school executive? Do girls and boys have equal access to all activities? In your primary classroom, take a fresh look at the reading scheme, library books and pictures. What messages are given about life choices and the importance of different work? In your high school, check out these statistics. The percentage of girls and boys doing 3 and 4 unit maths. State figures will put 2 boys for every girl in these higher maths areas. Also, check the percentage of girls and boys doing physics, chemistry, engineering science and home science. Limited or non-participation in maths, science and technical subjects in school can reduce career options by up to 80%. But it's more than career options. Self-image is being affected. Girls lack self-confidence, self-esteem. Sexism and sex role stereotyping can be very damaging to self-esteem. There is emphasis on the potential of girls. Sexism affects the opportunities for boys too, but it's the girls in our system who have most often had their chances limited and face barriers in getting the best out of their lives. There's always room for improvement in society and in school. If you see the disadvantages males and females face in society, education and work because of sexism, you can help reduce or eliminate them. Let's broaden school, training, career and life options for both girls and boys. Let's see that both sexes receive information about and support in non-traditional training and employment. Let's promote non-sexist education in all our schools. Make some changes and widen the choices available to both boys and girls.
Protect, each other. Use a
undone.
Australia's coal industry was established at the mouth of the Hunter River in the settlement of Newcastle in 1801, with 3 miners digging 9 tonnes of coal per day at Collier's Point. Later, convict miners were used to expand the workforce. In the years between 1847 and 1867, the industry grew rapidly, experiencing boom, depression, the opening of new coal seams, a new technology in transport, and an intensification of conflicts between miners and proprietors. From these were to emerge the embryonic modern industry. Many of the issues associated with the coal industry 120 years ago are pertinent today. There still remains an economic emphasis on getting the coal out of the ground through the introduction of new technology, an emphasis which is having a detrimental effect upon the jobs of coal workers and their communities. The Joint Coal Board Charter empowers it to ensure that coal reserves are conserved, developed, worked and used to the best advantage and in the public interest to promote the welfare of workers engaged in the industry. Mr McNally, how is the Joint Coal Board catering for the future welfare of coal miners?
The future of the welfare of coal miners is obviously best served by ensuring that there's coal mines there for the future miners to have. The board has a role in the assessment of the resources to make sure that they are not unduly sterilised. The colliery company, when it makes an application for a new coal mine, must also seek the consent of the board to open that coal mine. The board would then look at the working plan of the mine to make sure the resources are worked correctly, the market for the coal, the distribution of the coal, and the company viability to make sure that that company will be in existence into the future.
Now, Australia has traditionally exported its resources in a raw form. Would it be more profitable to apply new technologies locally to extend the uses of coal, for example in plastics and oil, rather than just look for new markets?
Well, that would help, but it takes a long time to develop and a lot of money to develop. The industry in itself is trying to get more productive with the introduction of better machinery, such as the long wall systems of mining, the mini wall system, and the better coal clearance capacities for the coal from the coal face to the surface of the coal mine.
If we were to apply new technologies locally to extend the uses of coal, how could we go about this?
Well, it would have to be government and industry money, because there's a lot of money involved in that sort of circumstance.
So these are long-term?
Long-term views, yeah.
A number of factors have been identified as possible causes for instability in the local coal industry. Now, do you think the problems are local or the result of pressures exerted by the world coal market?
Well, definitely the world markets. I mean, the situation in the world today is that there's a contraction of the world markets brought about by the breakup of the post-war equilibrium in that respect between the advanced powers. This is clearly expressed in America. America is now forced into a situation where they've got to take trade war measures and protectionist policies against the Japanese. So what that means is, of course, that you have all of these economies in a huge crisis. They've got to maximise their exports, minimise their imports. So this is bringing about a contraction of the world markets. Now, of course, countries like Australia that rely very heavily on export commodities for revenue and their wealth are affected directly by the crisis in the world economy.
Do you see miners' work practices as contributing or perhaps restraining Australian competitiveness in the coal industry?
Well, the question of work practices, this terminology arose in the Robe River dispute in Western Australia. It was used by Charles Copeman, Pico, Wallsend, in the attacks against the iron ore workers in Western Australia. Now, since that time, of course, we've seen various bodies taking up this slogan. State Labor governments took up that slogan in the attacks on the Newcastle State dockyard. what they call restrictive work practices, I call protective work practices. Work practices that defend the interests of workers. They represent their living standards, and also they represent their working conditions, the conditions of work that they work under. What the companies are saying is, when they ask workers to trade off and give concessions on work practices, they're saying to workers, well, look, you've got to take a cut in your living standard. So I don't see the problems in the industry as the work practices of miners. The coal industry in Australia is one of the most, or the most, productive in the world. What stands in the way of the development and the future of the coal industry is not the work practices of the employees, but the crisis in profit of the companies and the inability of those companies to secure markets throughout the world is now destabilising the industry, and you know, what you've got is the huge attacks on miners.
Mr. Wisby, it has been said that Australia is the world quarry, subject to international commodity price fluctuations. Do you see the Australian coal industry as too reliant upon its resources in a raw form?
Not too reliant, but when we're looking to the future, the reliance is always going to be there, but we must start thinking intelligently. And what I mean by this is that exporting coal in its raw form is always going to be a major part of the coal industry. The problem is there's an area which is marginal at the top, which we can roughly call boom and bust, that needs to be buffered by other new intelligent means, by adding value to new coal products and so on.
Can you tell me what you see as the responsibilities of coal producers to the future welfare of coal mining communities?
As we evolve as a society, we must continue to evolve socially. Now, the world itself has to face these problems, because the problems involved with, the social problems involved with coal and mining are those of the monoculture. In that when we allow monocultures to develop, we must recognise this and the social problems involved, and make sure that these areas also have buffer industries that allow for the take-up of displaced labour, and that can be grown as perhaps the monoculture environment declines.
What are the difficulties you can see associated with this that are particularly relevant to the Newcastle and Hunter region?
The major problem is the problem of changing a monoculture, and it's very much like turning a battleship or any large ship, aircraft carrier, with small tugs. We need to build new enterprises and new industries. Those enterprises and industries are very much like the tugs. Now, once you get that aircraft carrier turning, great. It gets more and more and more. And once we get the ball rolling with new industries and new enterprises, we can take some of the weight off the monocultural industries, such as coal and, of course, steel in the Hunter region, and start to build up new industries. But it's going to be a long, slow job, and there means cultural change in many areas, not just the modus operandi of work, but the skills required, the educational thrust that is needed to produce biochemists, electronics experts and so on.
The Australian Coal Association argues that the industry's present marketing predicament could be avoided. They say Australia can extract a tonne of coal, the cheapest in the world, but government charges and restrictive work practices limit production and hinder us from selling the cheapest coal. At the same time, others see the problem not on a local, regional or even national level, but rather on an international level. The world has a coal surplus, which has given buyers the control to set prices. Obviously, this is having a profound influence upon the coal industry in the Hunter Valley. The social ramifications should not be ignored. Retrenchments in the industry can and are having a dramatic effect upon communities established around the coal industry. In a traditional Labor area, workers feel let down by a seemingly unsupportive Labor government and a lack of national strategy. As for the future, predictions vary from where you stand within the industry.
For the future, if we make the right decisions,
we make the right investments, we will have a thriving industry based on raw coal, processed coal and new products in 10, 15 years' time. If we don't, we will still be digging coal out of the ground and we will be serving the rest of the world who will be processing that coal and making it into new products with lots of added value.
The future doesn't look very bright. All these areas in which miners live already have fairly high levels of unemployment. And the fact of the situation is, of course, that there are just not jobs there in Newcastle at the present time, and the jobs that are there are extremely low paid and without decent working conditions and decent wages, bonuses, etc. So in that respect, of course, the future doesn't look very good at all. As far as I'm concerned, as a miner, the only future for the coal industry and the future for these mining communities can only be through the nationalisation of the mining industry.
Well, obviously, some of the very uneconomical mines will close, just a few of them. The others, with the increases in productivity, should last the crisis through.
So essentially, this is an optimistic.
Yes.
Well, I hope you've enjoyed this short presentation of public television from Newvision. It's only a sample of what's been produced in the Newcastle and Hunter region. Use it as inspiration for your own productions, a source of new ideas, or purely as entertainment. Right now there are moves underway to bring television into the public arena, very similar to those which occurred in radio and led to the introduction of community FM stations. But to have public television, we need your support. If you have films, videos, or any ideas, just contact Newvision.